I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're doing something a little unusual. We're actually breaking our Lu Xun series up. We're interrupting it for this episode. This is the 50th anniversary. This week is the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. And we actually realized that we had recorded an episode on the opera, the American opera, Nixon in China, in 2021 or something like that.
Yeah, in the summer of 2021.
And then it just, for whatever reason, because we're both morons, didn't actually make it onto the podcast. So we were like, this would be a perfect time, give our listeners a little break from Lu Xun, air this episode. So is there anything we need to tell them, Rob?
Just that there's a piece of news that we're going to be talking a lot about in the podcast, and it's old news now. It was very current when we did the podcast. So if you find yourself thinking, wait, wasn't this like a year ago? Yes, it was a year ago. We just haven't aired it. But it should still be fairly topical, and I think you'll enjoy listening to us discuss it.
All right, let's get on to the show.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are looking at an opera, Nixon in China.
Yes, by the composer John Adams, one of my favorites.
1987?
Yep.
It's a little strange that we're looking at an American opera, but I should just point out, and we'll discuss this at the end of the podcast, this has become a news item recently.
It has, and not a particularly pleasant news item either.
But I think first, before we kind of get into how it fits in the news, we should talk about what this opera is and how it relates to Chinese literature.
Yes, and so it was originally commissioned for the composer John Adams, and it was first staged 1987 in Houston. If you have listened to any operas, the idea of an opera about Nixon's visit to China just sounds weird. And it did to people in 87, too.
It still does today.
It still does today. I first saw it in CD form on the library shelves, and I walked past and went, what? Because when you think opera, you think very large women with horned helmets singing very loudly, or big, loud, bombastic, usually classical-looking things. You do not think of Mao and Nixon sitting down talking about the news.
It's not a diplomatic genre.
It's not at all. And when it came out, that was one of the things that people had a hard time with was, this is not opera material. Like, this is just a bunch of statesmen talking about stuff.
And singing about stuff.
Yes, thank you, singing about stuff.
Rob, at the very beginning of the podcast, when no one was listening to us, we discussed a genre called the huaben a lot. And the huaben is interesting because it kind of like tried to fit things that didn't fit in the genre of the huaben into the huaben towards the end, and it just kind of collapsed.
Yeah.
How much is Nixon in China a sign that the opera is collapsing?
Well, that's part of the tension from when it was released. Was there were people who were huge fans of the opera precisely because it was making opera something new, something modern, relevant, contemporary, as opposed to yet another version of something that happened 800 years ago or something. This was John Adams' point of view as well, and the librettist, or the person who wrote the words, Alice Goodman, the poet. Now, of course, you're welcome to your own opinion. This is just why it was so dramatic when it was released. What, for our purposes, is the most interesting, or at least for me, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it in the first place, is a good chunk of it is direct quotations from Chairman Mao and Cultural Revolution era operas like Red Detachment of Women in particular.
Which, for me, I was kind of skeptical when we talked about doing this podcast because I was like, that doesn't really qualify just because it's quoting a bunch. More interesting for me, and Rob, tell me if I'm wrong, John Adams takes the model of the Chinese socialist Jiang Qing-inspired opera and sort of reimagines it for the American stage. You mentioned the Red Detachment of Women, which is one of the 8 model operas that everybody who was alive during the 1960s and 1970s in the PRC had to pretty much watch because there were really only a couple of things that were ever staged. This was one of them. And here at the University of Oregon, we had a series of artistic works in our museum displayed that drew off of Chinese propaganda, one of them being a poster of the Red Detachment of Women. And it was weird because women from that period, so women who grew up in the PRC, would come in and just all of a sudden break out in song. That Red Detachment of Women as an opera really affected people. And so I think it's fascinating that it also affected John Adams enough that he found value in these socialist era operas, and he decided to turn it into an American opera.
Well, and he doesn't necessarily turn it into an American opera, but he uses bits and pieces of it, and he also takes direct quotations from, as I said, Chairman Mao, but also some of the songs sung in that period, etc. Now, what's really interesting about that is not simply that he does it, but that he does it in what seems like a very sympathetic way. You know, usually in an American piece in particular, if you are talking about Maoist era China, it's either satirical or negative. It criticizes Chairman Mao, criticizes the party and the policies, which that's low-hanging fruit, right? There's not much to find good in that. What John Adams does is, like you just mentioned, looks at these as whatever else they were sources of high drama at the time. And there is a lot in common with the Red Detachment of Women and the overall bombast of opera in general, like big, loud. There's nothing subtle about opera in any culture, right?
Nope.
So what Adams is looking at is, well, what if we just took the drama inherent in this, quite apart from what political situation was in, and just restage it? Now, restaging it in this case means drawing off of minimalism, which I'm not going to talk a lot about because people aren't going to care. Suffice it to say, it's a fairly avant-garde experimental music form, especially American. All you really need to know about it is that if Mao had been alive, he would not have appreciated having his quotations set to minimalist classical music. Also, minimalism is not something that you would imagine an opera being done in. It would be like saying, hey, we're going to do an opera with a solo banjo performer.
The Baroque is not known for anything related to minimalism.
No, not that at all.
And opera is a particularly Baroque art.
Yeah, it precedes it, but yeah,
Sure.
Yeah. So anyway, it's very peculiar even now to listen to it and hear the Red Detachment of Women. There's a part in Act 2 where parts of the Red Detachment of Women are actually performed seriously, like as in they just belong in this opera. They're not like some weird communist garbage.
Sorry. So in Nixon in China,
Yes.
the opera, the Red Detachment of Women, the opera, is performed.
Yes.
In
not
a kind
in
of
its entirety, obviously.
Sure, but a bit of it in the same way that bits of Hamlet have bits of another play.
Actually, that's a great reference because it does function almost exactly like that. At one point, the landlord character in the original opera, because if you're gonna create a good opera for the people in the 60s, you have to have a landlord, an evil landlord. You have to. They
all do. The Chinese operas all do.
Yeah. Not necessarily in other countries, but the evil landlord in this one. In the performance, the actor who comes on stage as the landlord is the exact same actor who plays Henry Kissinger.
Weird.
Very weird, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. Are we to see Henry Kissinger as the evil landlord? Because the character of Pat Nixon in the opera seems to. And we're not going to go all the way down that road because we'll get way too much close reading on that one. The idea of the opera within an opera being the Red Detachment of Women is utterly fascinating. Now, in order to stage that, you have to have people who can play Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, Jiang Qing, and other Chinese people on stage.
Hang on, Rob. Houston, 1987.
Yo.
I mean, I know Houston today has a large community of Chinese folk who are living there. It's actually like quite a huge Chinese city, and the Chinese play an important role. But as I think back to 1987, when I was, I'm going to just say it, 3 years old.
Yikes.
Rob, you were already like 15, right?
I was, yeah. At least 30.
Houston in 1987, there were not that many non-Texans in the city. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, there was a Vietnamese population in East Texas, but I don't know how many opera performers were of Asian descent.
How did that work in 1987, and how does that work today?
Well, in 87, I mean, so far as I can tell, they just had white people playing all the roles, and...
so we would today think of that as quite controversial, I
yes,
think.
absolutely. And, in some ways, you could kind of get away with it, like you say, in 87, because there were not... Okay, I actually don't know how many opera performers in the U.S. were of Asian descent. Maybe there were thousands, and I'm an idiot.
No, sorry. You are an idiot.
I am an idiot.
But the question is whether or not you're right on that
Agreed.
particular fact.
Now,
actually, I think we're both idiots.
Well, I would agree. That's why we have a podcast. But it's anyway. This takes us to what we said at the beginning about our little news item, because the opera was, I mean, I won't say it's an all-time classic, but it was very unique and has a lot of very unique elements, and it's still staged a lot.
So it came out in 1987, and the critics all kind of panned it.
No, they did not all pan it. There was a lot of division, and the division itself is interesting because some hated it for being too pro-communist, some hated it for being anti, some hated it for being the death of opera, some loved it for being...
But many people did not like it.
A lot of people didn't like it.
Did not like it.
That is true.
And they said, this is going to die. This is,
this is not going to go anywhere. No. You can't have an opera about Nixon in China.
And yet,
it's still
has
here.
Had staying power. And what's fascinating is that it has had staying power internationally. In 2021, we have the Scottish Opera Company that's performing Nixon in China, and they have several different awards that they're nominated for. There is an accusation that they are both performing yellowface, that is, using this offensive makeup that is associated with racism, and they are also not allowing folks of East and Southeast Asian descent. That's the kind of category that is functioning in Britain, which, whether or not that's a relevant category,
right.
I think that's a different question. They're not using Asian actors to play these roles.
Right. And they've caught a lot of flack for it.
Someone pulled their award from one award.
They chose to, so far as I understand.
Yeah.
They weren't
and
forced
we're not,
to.
I don't know if y'all can tell this, but we ain't British.
No. I know we sometimes come across that way. But what's really peculiar about the company is that the actor playing Richard Nixon is an African-American.
The original 1987 opera had an African-American playing Nixon.
Did it really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Well, you learn new things every day, even from someone like Lee.
Even from an idiot like
Even
Lee.
from an idiot. Of course, I'm an idiot too, so it works. Staging him that way is an interesting thing to do, but it also suggests if you're capable of looking outside the lines that way, couldn't you just kind of find some other folks to play those roles? In the Chinese roles with actual people of Chinese descent, or at least Asian descent. It's an interesting situation because, A, there's a Scottish opera performing what's a very American moment. It would be like a Scottish opera producing some production of like the American Civil War or something.
I would say it's more like an American opera thing on the War of the Roses.
Maybe. Yeah, something like that. Our
French listeners are trying to figure out,
like, where are we going with this? We're trying to figure that out.
Frankly, though, we're always trying to figure out what the heck we're
That's why we have a discussion. And not just... We should maybe write scripts. Anyway, no,
we should maybe drink less while podcasting.
Or more. So there's an interesting situation with this opera. Now, what's funny to me about the commentary is that no one is commenting in this moment of high interest in China, I'll simply say. The fact that you still are performing Cultural Revolution operas sympathetically on stage. That's not a part of the discussion. If you are any kind of China student at all, that's one of the darkest periods in 20th century China. Having sympathetic performances of the art from that period is very strange.
It's super strange. It's interesting because in China and in the U.S., that period is kind of glossed over as like this sort of anomaly that's just like, well, we're not going to discuss that. We're not going to take it seriously. Now, Professor Roy Chan, who is a professor of both you and me, Rob, he's one of the few scholars in the U.S. to take the period of the Cultural Revolution and the literature produced during it seriously. That's, I think, one of the strong points of his scholarship, of the many strong points. That's a fascinating point, that he's one of the few people to do that. It's weird that John Adams is doing that too.
It is, and I think that's one of the interesting things about the discussion, not that people aren't having. So I absolutely understand the frustration with, especially now, with as global as most of these music forms are. It's hard to imagine there's literally not any Asian performers who could do these roles.
Let me jump in here.
Please do.
The critique, I believe, of this opera, the most recent performance of this opera, was started by Sarah Owen, who is a Scottish member of Parliament. This was her tweet about the Scottish opera. She said, "Why are there so few East and Southeast Asian people in this production?" So that was one of her points. Now, it's fascinating to me to go, wait a second. Why are you suggesting that someone who's Indonesian would be more qualified?
Because they look Asian, yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, well, honestly, like, Indonesian folks don't even phenotypically look more Chinese than someone from, like, Russia or Norway or something. There's something weird going on there, and I just want to point out that it's because East and Southeast Asians are classified as part of a singular group in the UK that she is making this observation, right? Like, would it really be better for even a Vietnamese British individual to be part of this opera when it's an opera about China? Right? Like, how is that any better than, a Scottish person playing a role in this opera? Because they're two totally different traditions, right? Like, Vietnam, although it draws a lot off of the experience of Chinese colonialism, it's a different national tradition. And we're kind of inserting ourselves into this discussion of British racial politics, which we're completely unqualified to say anything about, but we're going to say something about it anyway.
Sure.
So Julianne Cho Lambert argued that opera is a traditionally white-dominated world, and so he's representing these East and Southeast Asian groups, and he said that having folks who are from this population would be a plus, and Mr. Cho Lambert is absolutely right. I think we can say opera has been too white for too long.
Sure.
In terms of like how that plays out in the racial politics of this particular production, I'm skeptical as to the sort of charges by Sarah Owen and other folks. The way it's being cast is weird to me, because I don't know that someone who's Japanese would necessarily be more suited to performing these roles than to someone who's Scottish.
Well, and perhaps desire was an interesting thing too. How many Japanese or Korean or Malaysian, etc., people would want to play Chairman Mao in an opera? I mean, it's not like, and this takes us back to what was so strange and interesting about the original opera. Playing Chairman Mao on stage carries a whole. It's like playing Hitler in a movie or something. Like it's
springtime for Hitler and Germany.
That's from the film version of the producers. That's the film version.
Yeah,
anyway,
that is.
The stage version is a little different.
Interestingly, I actually had a close friend of mine who is Vietnamese American, and he actually played Hitler in the stage version of Springtime for Hitler in Germany. That was amazing. He did a fantastic job.
That would totally be worth watching. So anyway, but the question of desire here is an interesting one, because the assumption is simply that if you just throw some Asians in the piece, it'll look more realistic, et cetera, et cetera.
But that's equally problematic.
There's so many internal political problems with that. Like, it's not like Chairman Mao is this he's not even universally beloved in China. So even the idea of, hey, let's get a Chinese person to play Mao, maybe a lot of people don't want to play Mao. And one of the lingering questions about this opera is John Adams' presentation of both Nixon and Mao. Nixon has a ton of his own baggage. So having two extremely controversial and in some ways extremely negative figures, not even just in some ways, very negative figures from the 20th century portrayed, and I have to throw this in there as well, when the original opera, when they were coming up with it, John Adams and Alice Goodman, who wrote the lyrics, the libretto, both agreed this had to be a heroic opera. We're not doing satire here. This is a heroic moment. It's fascinating, etc., which is one of the things that drew a lot of heat at the time. This is Chairman Mao we're talking about. This is not, a governor of a state that just happened to do a bad job. This is
probably responsible for more deaths in the 20th century than any other figure.
Yeah.
Worse than Hitler, worse than Stalin, at least in terms of numbers.
Yeah, depending on how you attribute responsibility and all that. But yeah, I mean, it's regardless of death toll, this is a very bleak figure, and to present him on stage as a person of dramatic interest is a pretty daring move. It makes for high drama, but it also makes it difficult to know who to cast, because the assumption that there are dozens of Chinese in particular performers, Chinese American, Chinese British, Chinese Scottish performers waiting to perform this, being denied entry. Maybe that's true. I somehow kind of doubt that's true. One way or the other, it doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make the character of Chairman Mao suddenly believable and easy to follow. It makes it still very, very tricky.
I think the most interesting thing to me is how Sarah Owen, the sort of first critic of the Scottish performance of this opera, says, you're not representing the people who should be representing,
right?
Who should be represented in this opera. Why not? And she then casts this net of people who really have nothing in terms of their heritage to do.
They all have the same kind of eyes, and therefore let them on stage.
It's a very racist form of anti-racism. I'll say that.
You all have the same kind of eyes, and therefore Chinese, Malaysian, whatever.
You're all
same kind of thing.
Southeast Asian, so those are all the same thing. So why can't you perform Mao rather than these Scottish white folks? It's problematic. I hate to call a member of parliament out, but I'm going to do that anyways.
Our podcast is small enough. I seriously doubt anyone's going to care. My final thought on this is what continues to create press about this opera now is what created press before, which is also one of the things that defines a successful work of art, is that it can provoke far outside of its original time frame. If this only had to do with people who could still recognize Richard Nixon on TV and stuff when it came out, probably wouldn't still be here. But it's still here, still provocative, and still with the exact same questions today as there were 30 some odd years ago. I don't know that I could recommend everyone go out and listen to it beginning to end.
No.
It's not necessarily the easiest listen.
But take a look briefly for 10 minutes if you have time on YouTube. Check out some performances of the opera. I think it's fascinating to think about how this both connects with the racial politics of today and questions of kind of socialism during the Maoist period.
Agreed.
I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.